Thank you, Jean-Marc. It's good to be presenting among friends. A little bit less stress than it's a conference, I guess, when you don't know anyone. So today I'm going to talk about the project that is still ongoing. We're still collecting data, so you will see that the numbers are not that high. So we are going to increase them hopefully by the end of the year. So I'm not doing it alone. So this is a group project, and with Yui Suzuki from Jantenda University in Tokyo, Japan. And I believe Yui is actually online watching. And if you have questions, you can ask Yui, and she'll be able to answer them online. She's also part of Kazuya's team, so. And Juliana Ferry from Brunel University, London, who can't be here today, but who is also part of this project. This is a slightly different, so it's a bit of a, it's kind of following on sort of after Jean-Marc, so with a slightly different take on SLA. So I'm looking at more social factors associated with second language learning. And today I want to talk about a language attitude. So what is a language attitude? It's often defined as a consistently favorable or unfavorable manner with respect to a given object. So for instance, accents or dialects. And because they are consistent, they are meant to be measured, or we're supposed to be able to measure them if they are consistent. So there are two main approaches to measuring language attitude. One is direct, so we can just ask people, what do you think about this specific language variety or this dialect, and sort of elicit their attitudes in that way. However, obviously, no one wants to appear prejudiced or, you know, horrible. So it's very, it's kind of difficult to, you know, in a conversation say, you know, I hate accents or something like that. So researchers in language attitudes have to be kind of creative and clever and think about a little bit more interesting way of, you know, almost like coverted measures and trying to elicit those attitudes. So they've created the match guys technique, which was actually created in Canada. And the way to measure it is basically they would find a bilingual speaker who would record the same text read aloud, and then they would present those samples to a group of listeners who would rate those samples without realizing that in fact those samples were produced by the same speaker. So it's in some ways it's like tricking the person because the voice quality, the pitch, everything remains the same. The only difference is the accent. So thus they could infer that the what we're looking at is linguistic stereotypes rather than actual evaluations of what constitutes speech. So sounds very clever. Obviously, there's lots of issues with that approach, but it's been widely criticized, but it's still used in some studies. So when we ask about, since 60s and 1960s, this paradigm has exploded. There's lots of papers looking at language attitudes, and it's kind of when we try to identify the dimensions that constitute language attitudes, we have these three main dimensions, which is solidarity. So the adjectives that researchers use, such as pleasant or friendly or likable. Status traits, which is educated, successful, intelligent, and dynamism, which we don't see that often, but it's one of the major traits as well, which is often represented by the adjective energetic. So once the paradigm has been established, and initially it was to look at French Canadian accent of French and English. However, we now have a lot of literature about accented speech and different accents of English. So the findings from language attitude research have consistently found that if someone speaks what is perceived as standard variety, which is, for instance, if we're talking about English, but it's consistent in different languages as well. For instance, in English, we're talking about Midwest, kind of North American Midwestern sort of dialect, though that's debatable. And in English, it would be received pronunciation, or RP. So they tend to be rated more favorably on traits such as status or prestige, meaning education and wealth. And non-standard variety are rated more favorably in terms of social attractiveness or solidarity. So for instance, I don't know if we think about, we're talking about the UK and dialects in the UK, thinking about Liverpudlian accents. So for instance, often depends if you're in group, you rate it favorably on solidarity, but if you're out group, you might see it as in some ways less less prestigious accent. However, with foreign accents, findings are a little bit different. With foreign accent, what researchers have found is that speakers tend to speakers who speak accented, and I'm saying English because most research has been done with English because of its status as the international language. They seem to be received less favorably in terms of both solidarity and status. So they're downgraded on both major dimensions. There's no literature looking at dynamism at this point. And also EFL students, they often see native speaker models as desirable, and they also downgrade their own variety as undesirable, and that's the one that they share as well. So what do I mean by accent? So because I'm talking about language attitudes and accent. So accent is broadly defined as the phonological characteristics of speech. And in SLA research, second language accent is conceptualized as phonological transfer of first language phonological features to the speaker's second language. And research done by Kazuya and Pavel Trofimovich. Second language accents can be found to be linked to pronunciation accuracy, particularly in the production of segmentals and word stress. But in those studies, second language speakers' accentedness is typically measured according to the proximity of the speaker's use of English to the standard variety. So it's basically comparing how far you are on the spectrum from those varieties. So with this study, we wanted to see whether that would make a difference if we actually did not include native speakers of English at all. So that's kind of, I'm using a different keyboard. What is also apparent from research is that listeners are also important. So we find that if you are familiar with an accent, it's it's easier for you to have kind of an opinion of that accent because you are familiar. And but what we also find that listeners rely on different elements when they provide their evaluative judgments. So for instance, Dustin Crowther and Pavel Trofimovich and Talia, they looked at French listeners and Mandarin listeners, and they found that they paid attention to different features basically when they were evaluating speech. There is also another factor that listeners often make errors. So we assume that the task we asked them to do, that they understood and they are doing the task. But in fact, we may be wrong because there are studies that suggest, again, I'm using the wrong keyboard, that often the speakers are evaluated by their assumed nationality. So we can pilot it as many times as we want, but it depends on the actual final group of listeners who are listening to the speech. So you never know because we never actually ask what nationality they think the participants are, or whether they think they're native speakers of English or not. And McKinsey's 2015 studies findings suggest that listeners initially categorize speech samples either as belonging to native speakers or non-native speakers before they make any fine-grained judgment. So that's a lot of background for a study that we've done. So we wanted to bring it all together. So we wanted to see whether this listener factor, for instance, how does categorization or miscategorization of second language accents actually affect language attitudes of Japanese listeners toward Japanese accented English? And as you can see, we did not include any native speakers for comparison. So it was Japanese listeners evaluating Japanese speech. And we also wanted to see what type of pronunciation errors affected that social miscategorization of native speaker and non-native speakers. So which features were important, which features they paid attention to. And also we had a qualitative element, which we just wanted to see what their attitudes are towards L1 and L2 accented speech. So how did we do that? So first, the speech samples. So there were 44 male and female first language Japanese speakers of English of different second language proficiency. So we used the task that is outlined in Saito et al. 2016. So this is the a little story that they had to produce, and also this is a difference because it's sort of a spontaneous speech as opposed to read aloud elements of the Machigeist technique. So it's kind of so we could not control for the content of the speech. So that's obviously a confounding, not necessarily confounding variable, but it's something that we are going to look to explore further later on. So they produced this picture description. And after the speech were collected, we followed Trofimovich's accent 2012 paradigm in terms of doing speech analysis. So the analysis was done by 2 coders, and the inter-rater agreement was quite high. So these are the different dimensions that we use to analyze the speech. After that, each sample. So I'm only reporting on 12. First language Japanese listeners. But we are now at almost 50. So hopefully by the end of the year, we'll get to higher numbers. So each sample was rated by 12 first language Japanese listeners on a 6-point semantic differential scale on a number of traits. And we also included this category of native, non-native. So we wanted to see whether they felt that the voice belonged to a native speaker or non-native speaker. So these are the this is just an example. This is actually all the traits that we've used. So we've taken them from previous studies, specifically Jean and Hopper's, when they kind of try to find the common sort of denominators for the traits. So they kind of aligned with the solidarity, status, dynamism, dimensions of speech evaluation. And so the proficiency of the listeners was relatively low. So we have A2, B2 proficiency. Their age was mean age was 20, and they were taking English classes with the Japanese instructors, and they had no experience of study or work abroad. So we could say that they were naive listeners with not a lot of experience. So following the rating task, we invited them to provide comments on how important native-like pronunciation was to them. And data was analyzed using a series of t-tests, mixed effects modeling, and a thematic analysis. So what are the results? So our first research question is, how does miscategorization of L2 accents affect language attitudes of Japanese listeners towards Japanese accented speech? And as you can see, it does. It's in fact affected all 12 dimensions. Yeah, I know. So if the Japanese listeners believed erroneously that the voice belonged to a native speaker of English, they rated them higher on all dimensions. So it's but there were no native speakers. There were different proficiencies, but there were not native speakers involved in those studies. So we wanted, all dimensions, as you can see, all dimensions were affected, almost there. So we wanted to look at kind of what actually affected those ratings. So the results of mixed effect modeling. So what types of pronunciation errors affect the social miscategorizations of native speaker, non-native speakers? So you can see we have now only 4 out of 12 dimensions. So that's probably linked to because there are other things like grammar and vocabulary and the rest of it. So and we also looked only at Japanese speech. So the trade friendly, we could see that the more word stress errors speakers made, the less friendly they were perceived. And in terms of clarity, the more vowel insertions they had, the less clear they appeared to the listener. In terms of likability, faster meant actually more likable. So the faster you spoke, the more likable you were perceived to be. And in terms of active, the dynamism trait, it's understandable it was linked to word stress errors and articulation rate. So the faster, the more active, which is probably like an intuitive finding. You would agree that if you speak faster, you may be seen as more active. So we found that quite interesting. So we keep exploring that, and we want to include other dimensions as well. And in terms of the qualitative analysis, so the results of the thematic analysis, we coded them separately, and we compared our themes, and we agreed on 2 main themes, which is a native likeness and comprehensibility. And as you can imagine, they were in sort of a pool. There was a pool between these 2 dimensions, with comprehensibility kind of looking at communicative success and inclusivity. So it doesn't matter, because I want to be, I want to be understood, and I feel this sense of camaraderie with other non-native speakers. However, we can't downplay the role of prestige, social prestige, and kind of ease of understanding because of mutual intelligibility of sort of more standardized varieties. So in terms of how can we relate this to the previous findings? So what I think is important here is that the miscategorized L2 speech received more positive evaluation, which is an important consideration for study design. So if you are interested in exploring this kind of paradigm, it's very important to include actually either they guess the nationality or they indicate whether it's a native or non-native speakers, to ensure that they're doing what you want them to do. So kind of, it's almost like a stop and check kind of thing. So it looks like some of the samples were rated by the assumed nationality of the speaker, as similar to Bainhoff study. And familiarity, we were expecting that they would recognize them as belonging to Japanese speakers, but they did not guarantee recognition. So which is, again, another factor in terms of methodological design. Our results also suggest that intonation and segmental accuracy might be instrumental in eliciting positive attitudes towards second language speech from second language users. And that could be because they are exposed to native models and native speaker models in the classroom. And it's very likely that they rely on those models when they were making their judgment. Even though they were not present, they were still relying on those models. Those positive attitudes, I found there was a paper that came out in 2014 about the reference frame effect. It suggests that language attitudes can shift in response to the reference frame that listeners adopt when making social evaluations. So by not providing the native speaker model for comparison, our participants potential negative attitudes that could have been there because they still rated a group of, because there were no native speakers, so they still rated their fellow Japanese speakers on a positive scale. So perhaps they were attenuated because there was no model for comparison. So in terms of limitation, ideally, we want to follow up with in-depth interviews to kind of see that ambivalency and explore it a little bit more, and the role of vocabulary and grammar, because it was not a read aloud task, it was a spontaneous kind of more spontaneous speech, and also whether the expertise of listeners would make any difference, because naive listeners can still detect errors and use them as cues to make evaluative judgments. So perhaps, you know, whether that expertise would make a difference. So thank you.